For 50 years, Bill Anderson has carried a secret about George Jones. A confession so raw it haunted him, long after the lights went down. It wasn't a scandal, it wasn't gossip, it was George himself, in a rare, unguarded moment, admitting what he feared more than anything else. It was the mid-1970s. George Jones, the greatest voice in country music, was watching his life unravel in real time. The missed concerts, the drinking, the whispers in Nashville that the legend was slipping away. And one night, away from the microphones and the crowds, George turned to Bill and revealed the truth. He was terrified he'd be remembered not for his music, but for his downfall. Bill never told a soul. For decades, he carried those words like a weight, protecting the memory of a friend whose brilliance was matched only by his pain. But now, at 87, he's finally ready to share what George said that night. What drove George to make that confession? Why did Bill hold it for half a century? And how does that moment change the way we see George Jones today? By the mid-1970s, George Jones had earned his place as one of the most extraordinary voices in country music history. Critics called him the Rolls-Royce of country singers. Waylon Jennings famously said, "If we could all sound like we wanted to, we'd all sound like George Jones." His phrasing, emotional precision, and ability to turn a simple line into a soul-shaking moment made him untouchable. In an era crowded with talent, George stood apart. But behind the brilliance, the cracks were widening. His marriage to Tammy Wynette had ended in 1975. After years of turbulence, substance abuse, and public spectacle, the couple's split marked the end of a musical and cultural partnership that had defined country music's romantic image. After the divorce, George's personal problems intensified. His drinking, which had been a lifelong battle, deepened. Cocaine use entered the picture. His finances were in disarray. Lawsuits piled up. On the touring circuit, the effects became impossible to ignore. George began missing scheduled concerts with increasing frequency, sometimes disappearing for days at a time. Promoters who once banked on his name grew wary. Fans would pack into venues across the South, waiting for the voice they loved, only to hear that the possum hadn't shown up. Newspapers started reporting on these no-shows, and by the late 70s, the nickname No-Show Jones became cemented in the public consciousness. The Opry community, a tight-knit world where reputations traveled fast, was watching. George's absence from performances and erratic behavior were the subject of both concern and frustration. Fellow stars like Bill Anderson, who had shared Opry stages with George for years, saw the shift up close. Bill had known George since the early 60s, when they were both young performers navigating the booming Nashville scene. Unlike George, Bill built a reputation for consistency and professionalism. From that vantage point, he witnessed the growing gap between George's legendary talent and his increasingly fragile reality. Industry insiders were split. Some insisted that George's voice would carry him through anything. Others feared his career was at risk of collapsing under the weight of his personal battles. Meanwhile, George kept recording. Songs like These Days I Barely Get By reflected his inner turmoil more honestly than most interviews ever could. His artistry remained, sometimes breathtakingly so, but the chaos surrounding him was threatening to swallow everything he'd built. By 1978, George was at his lowest point, bankrupt, in legal trouble, and in worsening health. To those around him, it was unclear whether he'd make it out the other side. And among the people quietly observing this decline was Bill Anderson, a man who respected George's genius deeply, and who would carry what he saw during this period for the rest of his life. By the late 1970s, George Jones's career was standing on a knife's edge. The same voice that had made him a national treasure was now overshadowed by a reputation for unreliability. What had started as the occasional missed show became a pattern that dominated headlines and backstage conversations alike. Tour promoters complained of mounting losses, venues began hesitating to book him, and fans who had once idolized him were left frustrated and confused. George's personal life had spiraled alongside his professional troubles. His heavy drinking worsened after his divorce from Tammy Wynette, and cocaine became a regular part of his lifestyle. Friends, managers, and fellow musicians recalled periods when George would vanish for days without contact. Some nights he would arrive at venues in no shape to perform. Other nights he wouldn't arrive at all. Lawsuits over canceled concerts piled up, and his financial situation deteriorated rapidly. Those closest to the Nashville scene witnessed this decline not through tabloids, but in real time. The Grand Ole Opry remained a hub, where legends and newcomers crossed paths, and George was a fixture there when he showed up. Bill Anderson, by then already a veteran songwriter and performer with a reputation for dependability, occupied a unique position. He wasn't part of George's inner circle of enablers, nor was he a distant observer. He saw the unraveling from the vantage point of a peer who shared stages, dressing rooms, and industry corridors with him for decades. The contrast between George's public image and private struggles became more pronounced with each passing year. In interviews, he was still witty and charming, often deflecting questions about his health or behavior. On stage, when he did perform, his voice remained astonishing, clear, emotive, and commanding. But those moments were increasingly rare. The man who once set the standard for live performance now carried the stigma of No-Show Jones, a nickname that stung both personally and professionally. Within the industry, opinions were divided. Some old friends insisted George would recover, that his talent was simply too great to fade. Others quietly admitted that they feared his story would end in tragedy. Country music was changing rapidly in this era, with new stars emerging and the genre expanding beyond its traditional roots. There was a real sense that George, once the defining voice of heartbreak, might be remembered less for his artistry and more for the chaos surrounding him. Bill Anderson, known for his discretion, kept his observations private. He understood the power of reputation in Nashville, and he knew George's legacy was at risk. While others speculated publicly, Bill carried what he saw without commentary, choosing silence over sensationalism. He was witnessing one of the most painful chapters in George Jones's life, a chapter that decades later would shape the story he finally decided to tell. Bill Anderson's relationship with George Jones was forged through decades of shared stages, long tours, and the uniquely close-knit environment of Nashville's country music circuit. By the 1970s, both men were already pillars of the Grand Ole Opry. Bill had built his career on prolific songwriting and an unshakable reputation for professionalism, while George's name had become synonymous with vocal brilliance and increasingly instability. Their careers had run on parallel tracks since the early 60s, and that proximity gave Bill a front-row seat to George's decline. Unlike journalists or distant colleagues, Bill's observations came from within the same institutions that had shaped George's rise. The Grand Ole Opry wasn't just a performance venue, it was a gathering place for artists, songwriters, and industry veterans. Week after week, Bill saw how George's absence or erratic appearances became part of backstage conversations. Opry regulars understood that George's issues weren't just rumors, they were lived realities that affected touring schedules, reputations, and the morale of those around him. Bill's career had followed a different trajectory. Known as Whisperin' Bill for his soft vocal style, he cultivated a clean image, avoiding the excesses that entangled so many of his peers. This gave him a stability that few others enjoyed. As a result, when George's situation worsened, Bill occupied the role of a respected contemporary whose perspective carried weight. He didn't exploit what he saw for publicity. He stayed quiet, observing as a friend and fellow artist, rather than a commentator. George's behavior in this period was not hidden from those within the industry. Stories circulated among insiders about unpaid debts, canceled appearances, and last-minute disappearances. Musicians who had grown up idolizing him often ended up stranded on the road, their own livelihoods impacted by his unpredictability. Bill was part of that ecosystem. While he wasn't George's confidant in a tabloid sense, He was close enough to witness the shift in how people spoke about him, from reverence tinged with forgiveness to genuine worry about how his legacy would survive this storm. Publicly, Bill rarely addressed George's problems at the time. Interviews from that era show him focusing on his own projects, maintaining the kind of discretion that defined his character, but privately he couldn't ignore the contrast. Here was a man he had admired for decades, whose artistry had elevated the entire genre, struggling to hold his career together. In Nashville's small circles, that kind of transformation wasn't something you heard secondhand, it unfolded right in front of you. Bill's role during these years wasn't that of a savior or a critic. He was a witness, one of the few remaining peers from George's early days who stayed in the business long enough to see the full arc of his life. And as George's problems deepened, Bill quietly carried those memories with him, holding on to details he wouldn't share publicly for decades. As George Jones' personal troubles reached their lowest point in the late 1970s, a quiet truth was forming beneath the public spectacle. Friends, peers, and fellow performers could see the damage his behavior was inflicting on his career, but few understood the depth of George's own awareness. Behind the image of the hard-living country star was a man who was fully conscious of what was happening to his reputation. Years later, George would admit in interviews that he was deeply ashamed of that period. He said openly that he feared being remembered not for his music, but for his self-destruction. Those words would come decades after the events themselves. But in the industry circles George moved through, that fear wasn't entirely hidden. His colleagues witnessed the toll the no-show Jones reputation was taking on him. In his memoir and in various public reflections, George described how every missed concert, every headline, and every disappointed crowd ate away at him. He knew the legacy he had built was at risk. He once remarked that he was lucky people remembered the music instead of the mess, a rare moment of frankness about how precarious his public image had become. Bill Anderson was among those who recognized this tension long before George ever spoke about it publicly. Their careers overlapped for more than 2 decades, and Bill watched the shift in perception happen in real time. He saw how fellow artists spoke about George with a mixture of admiration and frustration, and how audiences began to associate his name as much with unpredictability as with brilliance. Unlike journalists or biographers, Bill didn't rush to reveal what he knew. He carried it quietly, as he did with many private industry observations. Bill's long silence is what gives his later reflections weight. He was part of the Opry community during George's most difficult years, sharing stages and backstage spaces, at a time when George's fear about his legacy was becoming palpable. It wasn't something George addressed publicly then, but it was visible to those who paid attention, and Bill did. For decades, Bill refrained from discussing this aspect of George's life. He never inserted himself into the narrative during George's comeback years, nor after his death in 2013. But as one of the few surviving peers from that era, his decision to speak about what George was feeling carries a particular gravity. He isn't revealing gossip or scandal. He's offering a rare perspective from someone who witnessed the gap between George Jones's public persona and private fears, and chose for half a century to let history unfold before telling his side. This unspoken fear, of being remembered for the chaos instead of the music, was never splashed across newspapers at the time. It existed quietly, shared only through glimpses and rare admissions. Bill Anderson saw it up close, long before the rest of the world heard George say it himself. By the end of the 1970s, George Jones's career seemed to be running out of road. His finances were in ruin, his health was poor, and his reputation as no-show Jones threatened to eclipse everything he had achieved. Yet against that bleak backdrop came one of the most astonishing turnarounds in the history of country music. In 1980, George released He Stopped Loving Her Today, a recording that would not only revive his career but redefine his legacy. Produced by Billy Sherrill, the song was initially met with hesitation from George himself. He reportedly doubted it would resonate with audiences. even refusing to record it at first. Cheryl persisted, convinced that the heartbreaking ballad would become a classic. He was right. When the single was released, it stunned critics and fans alike. The recording was raw, intimate, and vocally flawless, proof that even at his lowest, George Jones remained unmatched as an interpreter of song. The track reached #1 on the Billboard Country chart and won multiple awards, including a Grammy for Best Male Country Vocal Performance. The impact of that single went far beyond its chart performance. He Stopped Loving Her Today became a cultural landmark, frequently cited as the greatest country song ever recorded. It marked the beginning of George's rehabilitation in the public eye. Suddenly, the man many had written off was back at the center of the genre. In the years that followed, his touring schedule stabilized, his legal battles were addressed, and his reputation slowly began to mend. Industry insiders, including Bill Anderson, watched this transformation closely. For those who had seen George at his lowest, the comeback carried a special weight. Bill understood, perhaps better than most, what this resurgence meant in the context of George's private fears. For years, George had worried that history would remember only his chaos. Now history was being rewritten in real time. Through the 1980s and into the 90s, George Jones was celebrated not as a cautionary tale, but as a living legend. He was inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame in 1992, and tributes from peers poured in. Younger generations of artists cited him as their greatest influence. Award shows honored him repeatedly, and he continued to perform well into the later stages of his life, his voice still remarkably intact. Bill Anderson remained a fixture of the Nashville establishment during this entire period. As George rebuilt his image, Bill kept his memories of those darker years private. He didn't speak about the fears George had carried during the 70s, even as the narrative shifted from decline to triumph. He let the music do the talking, watching as George Jones's legacy solidified around the one thing he had always hoped would outlast everything else: the songs. George Jones's final years were marked by stability and reverence rather than the turbulence that had once defined him. After decades of personal and professional battles, he settled into a quieter rhythm. His health became a growing concern, but his stature within the genre had never been greater. He continued performing well into his later life, regularly appearing on the Grand Ole Opry and touring to devoted audiences who saw him not just as a star, but as a living embodiment of country music's soul. Tributes poured in throughout the 2000s. George received the National Medal of Arts in 2002, one of the highest honors bestowed upon an American performer. In 2008, the Kennedy Center recognized his contributions to culture, cementing his position as an artist whose work had shaped generations. These accolades stood in sharp contrast to the uncertainty of the late 70s. The man who once feared his legacy would be defined by failure now watched as the country embraced him as a legend. When George Jones passed away on April 26, 2013, at the age of 81, Nashville paused. Thousands attended his funeral at the Grand Ole Opry House. The service drew an extraordinary range of artists, from country traditionalists to modern stars, reflecting the breadth of his influence. Presidents, fellow performers, and fans all paid tribute to the man whose voice had carried their stories for more than half a century. Bill Anderson was among those present in that final chapter, not as a footnote, but as one of the few remaining contemporaries who had known George before the myth fully formed. By that time, Bill's own career had spanned more than 5 decades. He had watched country music evolve through seismic changes, yet George's voice remained a fixed point in that landscape. Bill spoke publicly after George's passing with characteristic grace, focusing on the music rather than the darker chapters. But the memories of those turbulent years and George's private fears remained with him. What makes Bill's perspective singular is his longevity. Many of George's peers from the 50s and 60s were gone by the time George died. Bill endured, still performing, still writing, still appearing at the Opry. That endurance turned him into a kind of living archive of a shared history, a witness to both the heights and depths of George's journey. As tributes celebrated George Jones's songs, his awards, and his cultural impact, Bill carried something more personal: the knowledge of how close George came to losing control of his legacy. Decades earlier, he had chosen silence. In George's final years, he maintained that discretion. And in the years that followed, as one of the last voices from that era, he finally began to share what he had witnessed, not to sensationalize, but to complete the picture of a man whose fear nearly became his legacy, and whose artistry ultimately triumphed. By the time Bill Anderson entered his late 80s, he occupied a rare place in country music. He wasn't simply a legend in his own right. He was one of the last living links to the generation that had shaped the genre's golden age. His longevity gave him a perspective few others could offer. Younger artists approached him as a mentor. Historians sought him out as a primary source. When Bill reflected on his peers, it wasn't from the outside looking in. It was from the vantage point of someone who had been there through every shift. Bill's decision to speak about George Jones in greater depth came after decades of silence. He had always chosen discretion, even during the years when sensational stories about George dominated tabloids and documentaries. In interviews later in life, Bill explained that his reluctance to comment on private struggles stemmed from respect. The country music community in their era valued loyalty. Artists protected one another's reputations, especially when personal demons threatened to overshadow careers. Bill had lived by that code. But time changes the role of memory. As George's passing receded into history, and more of their contemporaries died, Bill understood that the first-hand accounts were dwindling. In his memoirs and interviews in the 21st century, he began to offer a more nuanced view of his colleagues, not to diminish them, but to preserve an honest record. With George Jones, that meant acknowledging both his unmatched brilliance and the vulnerability he rarely shared publicly. When Bill revealed that George had quietly feared being remembered for his chaos rather than his music, it wasn't framed as a scandal. It was a moment of humanity. George had later spoken about those fears himself, but Bill's perspective carried the weight of someone who had witnessed the fragile years when those fears were unspoken. By waiting half a century, Bill ensured that his words would be received as part of history, not gossip. His decision reflects a broader truth about legacy in country music. The genre thrives on myth-making, but it depends on people like Bill to fill in the spaces between the myths, to remind audiences that behind the voices and the legends were human beings grappling with real doubt. For George Jones, that doubt almost consumed his legacy. Bill's testimony ensures that future generations understand how close that came to happening, and how remarkable his comeback truly was. At 87, Bill Anderson remains a living witness to a transformative era. His decision to finally share this part of George's story isn't about rewriting history. It's about completing it. And in doing so, he gives George's journey a dimension that only someone who walked beside him could provide: the fear, the fall, the redemption, and the fragile humanity behind one of the greatest voices country music has ever known. George Jones's life remains one of the most complex and unforgettable stories in country music. His voice defined a generation, his struggles nearly derailed it, and his comeback ensured that his name would live far beyond his lifetime. Through every stage of that journey, Bill Anderson watched, not as a distant observer, but as a peer who shared the same stages, the same institutions, and the same shifting landscape of Nashville. For decades, Bill carried what he'd seen in silence. His choice to speak only late in life transformed his memories from private reflections into historical record. By revealing George's private fear of being remembered for his chaos rather than his music, Bill added a layer of humanity to a story often told through headlines and accolades. Today, George's legacy stands where he hoped it would, defined by the songs, and through Bill Anderson's testimony, we understand more clearly how close that legacy came to slipping away, and how powerful it was when the music endured. For more emotional stories, check out this video.